The notice had been there longer than the others. It sat lower on the board, set beneath newer parchment, though the paper itself did not appear older. No one stood before it. No hand reached toward it. The guild hall held its warmth in a steady way. Lanterns hung from the beams overhead, their amber light settling across tables, across the edges of chairs, across the grain of wood worn smooth with use. The air carried the scent of oil and timber, with something quieter beneath it. Voices moved through the room at an even level. Near the far wall, two travelers spoke in low tones, their words spaced with pauses that did not seem to wait for anything. By the hearth, a guild attendant adjusted a small stack of notices, aligning their edges before setting them down again. The fire gave a soft, steady glow. Brenna Stonehand stepped inside and came to a stop just past the doorway. Her fur cloak rested along her shoulders, catching a trace of lanternlight. She looked across the room for a moment, then moved further in. Edrin Vale followed, one hand resting lightly against the strap of his satchel. His gaze moved through the hall, passing from the hearth to the far wall, then toward the inner space. Kayla Thorne entered without sound. She remained slightly behind the others, her hood casting a soft shadow across her face. Her attention moved across the room in quiet passes, touching the edges of tables, the space between chairs, the placement of light. Thomas Greywick stepped in last. A faint glow rested along the folds of his robes as he paused near the threshold, then continued forward. No one spoke. They moved further into the hall together, their steps quiet against the wood. The room continued as it had been. The request board stood along the inner wall, set between two lanterns. Their light fell evenly across its surface. A few notices had been placed there. Some sat higher, some lower. The parchment varied in tone and texture, though none appeared newly pinned. Brenna came to stand before it. Edrin stepped beside her. Kayla remained a pace back. Thomas lingered just behind them. They looked without moving. The notices were simple, small tasks written in a steady hand, deliveries, repairs, messages carried from one place to another. Each remained where it had been placed. Edrin's gaze moved across them, then settled lower on the board. One notice sat beneath the others, set with more space above it than below. Brenna's attention followed. Kayla's gaze moved between the notice and the board around it. Thomas looked on. They stepped closer. The parchment lay flat against the wood. Its edges had softened slightly, though the surface remained smooth. The ink held its shape, each line clear. No name had been written. No marking showed where it had come from. The lines rested there, evenly spaced. A path east of the guild. Something noted along it. No further detail followed. no indication of time, no instruction given. Edrin read it once, then again. Brenna stood with her weight settled evenly, her gaze resting on the parchment. Kayla's attention moved briefly to the pin, then to the space around it. Thomas remained still. "It has been here," he said. His voice did not carry beyond the space between them. Edrin gave a small nod. Brenna did not move. Kayla's gaze returned to the board. The room behind them continued. The travelers near the wall spoke in the same low tones. The attendant adjusted the stack of papers again, aligning their edges. The fire shifted, then settled. No one reached for the notice. No one removed it. The lanternlight rested evenly across the board. The parchment did not move. Brenna's hand came to rest briefly against the edge of the wood, then lowered again. Edrin's gaze moved once more across the lines, then lifted. Kayla's attention shifted toward the room, then returned. Thomas looked at each of them in turn, then back to the board. No one spoke. After a while, Brenna stepped back. Edrin followed. Kayla turned slightly, her attention widening to the room. Thomas remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze resting on the lower notice. Then he stepped away. The notice stayed in place. The lanternlight continued to fall evenly across the surface. Behind them, the hall held its steady rhythm. The travelers remained near the wall. The attendant worked near the hearth. The fire gave a quiet glow. Brenna moved toward the center of the room. Edrin walked beside her. Kayla followed. Thomas came after. No one turned to watch them. The door stood open at the far end of the hall. Evening air moving through in a slow exchange. They crossed the space without pause. The request board remained behind them. The room continued. Outside, the evening waited. The room they used sat along the upper floor, set back from the main hall, where the lantern light softened as it reached upward. The air felt still there. A single lantern rested on the table near the wall. Its light spread slowly, touching the edges of the room without filling it completely. The corners remained dim. Their packs rested where they had been left earlier. Brenna stepped inside and set her hand briefly against the back of a chair before moving past it. She lifted her pack onto the table, the leather giving a muted sound against the wood. Edrin followed and placed his satchel beside it. He opened the flap and looked inside, then adjusted the contents with small, careful movements. Kayla moved towards the window along the far wall. The shutters were closed, though a thin line of evening light pressed through the seam between them. She stood there, then turned back toward the room. Thomas entered last and closed the door behind him without sound. He remained near it, then crossed to the table. No one spoke. Brenna unfastened the straps of her pack and opened it. Inside, a folded cloak rested over a few wrapped items. She lifted the cloak, set it aside, then adjusted what lay beneath before closing the pack again. Edrin took a small bundle from his satchel and unwrapped it. Dried herbs rested inside. He shifted them slightly, then wrapped the bundle again and returned it. Kayla moved from the window to the table. Her gaze passed over the packs without settling. She rested her hand against the edge of the wood, then lifted it again. Thomas adjusted the lantern by a small amount. The light shifted across the table, along the walls, across the floor. He stepped back. Brenna secured the straps of her pack and lifted it from the table. She held it briefly, then set it down again. Edrin closed his satchel and rested his hand against it. Kayla turned one of the chairs slightly, so it no longer faced the table directly. Thomas's gaze moved across the room, pausing at each of them before returning to the lantern. Brenna lifted her pack again and settled it against her back. The straps fell into place along her shoulders. Edrin followed, securing his satchel across his body. Kayla moved toward the door, her hand resting lightly against it. Thomas remained by the table, his gaze resting where the packs had been. The lantern continued its steady glow. Brenna stepped toward the door. Kayla opened it without sound and stepped into the corridor. Edrin followed. Thomas came last, lowering the lantern's flame slightly. The light dimmed. He closed the door behind him. In the corridor, the light from the main hall reached upward in softened layers, touching the walls and floor. Their steps remained quiet as they moved along it, passing doors that stayed closed. At the end of the corridor, the stairway led down toward the guild hall. The light grew warmer as they descended. The hall remained as before. The same travelers stood near the wall. The attendant moved near the hearth, aligning a small stack of papers. Brenna crossed the room at an even pace, her gaze moving briefly toward the request board before continuing on. Edrin followed beside her. Kayla passed through without pause, her attention already turned toward the doorway beyond. Thomas slowed near the edge of the room. His gaze rested on the board. The notice remained in place. He turned and continued on. The door to the outside stood partially open. Evening air moved through in a slow exchange, carrying the faint scent of earth and cooling stone. Brenna stepped through first. Edrin followed. Kayla passed into the open air. Thomas stepped through last, the door shifting slightly behind him as it settled. Outside, the light had lowered. The road stretched outward, worn smooth in places and uneven in others. Its edges softened into grass and packed soil. They moved forward at a steady pace, their steps falling into a quiet rhythm. Behind them, the guild hall remained lit. Ahead, the road continued east. The road stretched outward from the guild in a gradual line, its surface worn by long use. Stone and packed earth shifted beneath each step, some places smoother, where many had passed, others uneven, where the ground had settled differently. The evening light rested low across it. Grass lined the edges, bending slightly where it met the path. Beyond that, the land opened into long stretches of field, broken here and there by clusters of trees that stood without pattern. Brenna walked at a steady pace, her steps even, her weight settled through each movement. Edrin moved beside her, his satchel resting against his side, shifting slightly with each step. Kayla followed a half step behind, her attention moving outward along the edges of the road, then returning again. Thomas walked with them, his gaze moving between the ground ahead and the distance beyond it. No one spoke. Their steps formed a quiet rhythm against the surface of the road. Leather, cloth, and earth met in soft, repeating sounds. The guild hall remained behind them, its lanternlight no longer reaching the path. The air cooled gradually as they moved further from it. A breeze passed across the fields, light and without direction. It moved through the grass in slow waves, then settled again. A cart approached from the distance, its wheels turning steadily. The wood gave a low, familiar sound as it met the uneven ground. The driver nodded once as he passed, his gaze moving over them without pause. Brenna inclined her head slightly. Edrin's gaze followed the cart briefly before returning to the road. Kayla watched the movement of the wheels until it had passed fully, then shifted her attention outward again. Thomas turned his head just enough to follow the sound as it faded. Their pace remained even. The fields gave way gradually to longer shadows cast by the trees ahead. The road curved slightly. Footprints marked parts of the path, some fresh, some softened by time. They crossed and overlapped without pattern, Brenna stepped through them without pause. Edrin's gaze passed over them, then lifted. Kayla's attention lingered there, tracing the shapes where the impressions had settled. Thomas did not slow. A bird crossed overhead, its movement brief against the dimming sky. The sound of its wings did not carry far. The light continued to lower. Lanterns had not yet been lit along this stretch of road. The remaining daylight held enough presence to define the path. They walked on. The surface beneath them shifted slightly as the road passed over a shallow rise. The change in incline was gradual. At the crest, the land beyond opened again. More trees stood ahead, closer together now, their branches forming a loose canopy that gathered the fading light. The road moved between them. Brenna entered the shaded stretch without pause. Edrin followed. Kayla's gaze lifted briefly to the branches above, then lowered again. Thomas walked beneath them, the dimness settling evenly across his path. The sound of their steps softened as the ground changed beneath them. Leaves rested along the edges of the road, some scattered across it, shifting lightly as they passed. A marker stone stood at the side of the road, its surface worn smooth. A faint carving remained along its face. Brenna's gaze passed over it. Edrin slowed slightly as he looked at it, then continued on. Kayla's attention moved across the carving, tracing what remained of its shape before letting it go. Thomas did not turn his head. The trees thinned again, the open land returning in long, quiet stretches. The last of the daylight rested low across the horizon, its colour softening into muted tones. No lanterns appeared ahead. No structures broke the line of the fields. Their steps continued in the same steady rhythm. Brenna walked on, her posture unchanged. Edrin moved beside her. Kayla followed, her gaze moving outward and back again. Thomas walked with them, his attention resting where the road met the distance. Ahead, it continued east. The road continued east until the land began to gather inward. The fields narrowed, giving way to low fences set at uneven intervals. Some leaned slightly, their wood weathered to a pale grey. Others stood straighter, though none appeared newly placed. The grass along the road grew shorter. A line of trees marked the far edge of the fields, their trunks spaced irregularly, their branches still against the dimming light. Beyond them, the village rested. It did not rise into view all at once. The first shapes appeared gradually. Roof lines set low, their angles softened by distance. A thin thread of smoke lifted from somewhere within, moving upward, before fading into the evening air. Brenna continued forward at the same pace. Edrin walked beside her. Kayla's gaze moved across the outer edges of the village, tracing the line where the trees gave way to open space. Thomas looked ahead. A post stood at the side of the road. Brenna passed it without turning. Edrin's gaze moved toward it briefly, then forward again. Kayla slowed slightly as she drew even with it, her attention resting there before returning to the village ahead. Thomas walked on. The trees at the boundary of the village stood without forming a clear entrance. The road moved between them, their branches reaching overhead without fully meeting. The light shifted beneath them, dimming slightly as it passed through the leaves. They stepped through. On the other side, the road carried on, its surface smoothed in places where it had been walked more often. The ground felt more settled beneath their steps. The first buildings stood at a distance from one another, each set with space around it. Their walls were simple, their roofs sloped, their surfaces marked by time and weather. A window stood open on one of them. No movement showed within. Brenna walked on. Edrin's gaze moved towards the window, then away. Kayla's attention lingered on the spacing between the buildings, then shifted back to the road. Thomas continued forward. A figure moved near one of the structures farther ahead, crossing from one side of the road to the other. The movement was unhurried, the steps even. The figure did not look toward them. The road passed between the buildings without narrowing. The ground along its edges had been worn evenly. A length of rope hung between two posts near one of the homes. Cloth rested over it, still and unmoving. Brenna's gaze passed over it. Edrin looked briefly at the cloth, then back to the path. Kayla's attention moved to the posts, then to the ground beneath them. Thomas did not turn. They moved further in. The space between the buildings remained uneven, though no pattern formed. Some stood closer, others set back. A door stood open along one of the structures. The interior beyond it remained dim, the lantern inside giving only a small amount of light. Brenna passed without slowing. Edrin's gaze rested there briefly, then lifted. Kayla moved past, her attention shifting again to the edges of the village. Thomas followed. A second figure stood near the side of the path ahead, their posture still, their hands resting at their sides. As the group approached, the figure stepped aside, leaving the center of the road clear. Brenna inclined her head slightly as she passed. The figure returned the gesture after a pause. Edrin's gaze met theirs briefly. Kayla passed without turning. Thomas followed. Behind them, the figure remained where they had stepped aside. The village extended further in, though its edges were not clearly marked. The buildings did not gather tightly, nor did they spread far apart. A lantern hung outside one of the homes, its light already lit despite the remaining daylight. It burned steadily, its glow contained within a small circle. Brenna walked past it. Edrin's gaze moved across its surface. Kayla's attention rested briefly on the way the light met the wall behind it. Thomas continued. No voices carried through the space. No animals moved along the road. No tools sounded against wood or stone. The quiet held. They moved deeper into the village, their steps maintaining the same steady rhythm. The road stretched ahead between the buildings, extending further inward. The light lowered further, settling across the surfaces of wood and stone. Nothing called for attention. The road extended further into the village, passing between the buildings without narrowing. The ground beneath their steps felt even, worn in a way that suggested many had walked it, though no one moved along it now. The light settled lower, drawing longer shadows across the path. A figure stood near the edge of the road ahead, facing one of the buildings. Their posture remained still, one hand resting lightly against the wood of the doorframe. Brenna approached at the same steady pace. Edrin walked beside her. Kayla followed, her gaze moving between the figure and the space beyond them. Thomas looked ahead. As they passed, the figure lowered their hand from the doorframe and turned slightly, as if to follow their movement. Brenna inclined her head. The figure responded after a brief pause. Edrin's gaze met theirs for an instant, then moved on. Kayla passed without turning. Thomas followed. Behind them, the figure remained near the doorway. The buildings along this stretch stood closer together. Their walls carried the same marks of time, though the surfaces appeared more evenly worn. A window stood open on one side of the road. A length of cloth rested along its edge, folded once over itself. Brenna's gaze passed over it. Edrin looked toward it briefly. Kayla's attention lingered there, then shifted again. Thomas continued. Another figure crossed the road farther ahead, moving from one building to the next. Their steps were measured, neither hurried nor delayed. They reached the opposite side and paused, their hand resting against the door before entering. The door remained open behind them. The space inside held a dim light. The group continued forward, A narrow bench sat along the side of the road, its surface worn smooth. Brenna passed it without slowing. Edrin's gaze moved across it, then forward again. Kayla traced its length with her eyes as she walked. Thomas followed. The road carried them past another open doorway. Inside, a lantern hung from a beam, its light contained within the room. The floor beyond the threshold remained still. Edrin's gaze rested there briefly. Kayla moved past, her attention shifting outward again. Brenna continued on. Thomas followed. A figure stood farther along the road, facing away from them. Their posture remained steady, their hands resting at their sides. As the group approached, the figure stepped slightly to one side, leaving space along the center of the path. Brenna inclined her head as she passed. The figure returned the gesture after a short delay. Edrin's gaze met theirs as he moved past. Kayla continued without turning. Thomas followed. The figure remained where they had stepped aside. The road extended on. The spacing between the buildings shifted again, widening slightly before narrowing once more. A length of rope stretched between two structures farther ahead, though nothing hung from it. Brenna passed beneath it. Edrin glanced toward it. Kayla's attention moved along its length. Thomas continued forward. The light lowered further, settling into the spaces between the buildings, resting along the edges of doorways and windows. A lantern had been placed along the ground near one of the homes, its glow faint against the dimming light. Brenna walked past it. Edrin's gaze moved across it. Kayla's attention rested briefly on the way the light touched the ground. Thomas followed. No voices carried. No tools moved. No doors closed. The air remained still. They continued further into the village, their steps settling into a quiet rhythm. A doorway stood ahead, open to the road. A figure stood just inside, their form partially obscured by the dimness within. As the group approached, the figure shifted slightly, though they did not step forward. Brenna passed. Edrin followed. Kayla moved past, her gaze passing briefly across the interior. Thomas followed. The figure remained where they stood. The road extended further in, passing between more buildings set in the same quiet arrangement. The light settled across wood and stone. They walked on. The road extended deeper into the village, passing between buildings set at uneven distances. The ground beneath their steps remained level, worn smooth in places. The light continued to lower. A building stood ahead, with its door open toward the road. A lantern hung just inside, its glow contained within the doorway. The space beyond it held still. Brenna approached without slowing. Edrin walked beside her. Kayla's gaze moved across the doorway, then along the wall beside it. Thomas followed. A figure stood just inside the threshold. Their posture remained steady, their hands resting loosely at their sides. As the group came near, the figure turned slightly toward them. Brenna inclined her head. The figure returned the gesture after a short delay. Edrin's gaze met theirs. Kayla's attention rested briefly within the room. They continued on. Inside, a table stood near the far wall. A few objects rested on it, their shapes softened by the lanternlight. A chair had been pulled slightly away from it, angled toward the center of the room. Another doorway stood open farther along, though no lantern lit its interior. The space beyond it held a dim outline of walls and floor. Brenna passed it. Edrin's gaze shifted toward it, then forward again. Kayla's attention lingered at the edge of the threshold before moving on. Thomas continued. A figure stood near the side of the road ahead, facing the path. Their posture remained still, their gaze resting somewhere along the ground. As the group approached, the figure lifted their head slightly. Brenna inclined hers. The figure responded after a pause. Edrin's gaze met theirs briefly. Kayla moved past without turning. Thomas followed. The figure remained where they stood. The buildings along this stretch held the same quiet presence. Doors stood open or closed without pattern. Windows remained uncovered, their interiors dim. A length of wood had been set along the ground near one of the structures, its surface worn smooth. It rested parallel to the road. Brenna stepped past it. Edrin's gaze moved across it. Kayla's attention followed its length before lifting. Thomas walked on. A voice came from one of the open doorways as they passed. It did not rise. It did not carry beyond the space it occupied. The words settled near the threshold. Brenna slowed slightly as she drew even with the doorway. Edrin turned his gaze toward it. Kayla remained where she was, her attention shifting toward the sound. Thomas paused just enough for them to come level. Inside, a figure stood near the far side of the room. Their posture remained relaxed, one hand resting against the surface of the table. They looked toward the group. "You came along the road," the figure said. The words rested in the space between them. Brenna inclined her head. Edrin's gaze remained steady. Thomas looked toward the figure. Kayla stood without movement. The lantern light within the room held steady. After a brief pause, Edrin spoke. The road continued. The figure inside gave a small nod. It does, they said. Their gaze moved between the four of them, then returned to the table beside them. The room remained quiet. Brenna stepped forward again. Edrin followed. Kayla moved with them. Thomas came last, his gaze passing once more across the doorway before returning to the road. Behind them, the voice did not continue. The road continued beneath them, passing between buildings that held the same quiet arrangement. A lantern hung from a beam farther ahead, its light already lit. It cast a soft circle onto the ground beneath it. Brenna walked through it. Edrin followed. Kayla's attention moved briefly to the edge of the light. Thomas stepped through after them. The circle of light remained behind. No other voices followed. The air held still. They moved on. The road extended further into the village, passing between buildings that stood in the same quiet spacing. The ground beneath their steps remained even, the surface worn smooth. The light had lowered enough that the lanterns now held more of the space. One hung outside a doorway to the left, its glow resting along the wall and onto the ground beneath it. Another stood farther ahead, placed near the edge of the road, its light contained within a small circle. They moved between them. A figure stood near the lantern ahead, facing the road. Their posture remained still, their hands resting at their sides. As the group approached, the figure inclined their head. Brenna returned the gesture. The figure's gaze moved across the four of them, then settled somewhere beyond. Edrin's attention rested there briefly. Kayla's gaze followed the line of sight, then returned. Thomas continued forward. The figure did not move further. A doorway stood open along the right side. A figure sat just inside, their back resting against the wall, their hands placed loosely in their lap. "You came along the road," they said. The words remained near the doorway. Brenna inclined her head. Edrin's gaze moved toward them. Kayla remained where she was, her attention resting briefly within the room. Thomas looked once, then forward again. They continued. Another building stood ahead, with its door partially open. A lantern hung inside, its light reaching outward just enough to meet the edge of the road. A figure stood within, facing the doorway. "You came along the road," they said. The words settled in the same way. Brenna inclined her head again. Edrin gave a small nod. Kayla's gaze passed across the figure, then lifted. Thomas remained quiet. They moved on. The road passed between more buildings, their surfaces marked by time. Windows stood open or closed without pattern. Some held lanternlight within, others remained dim. A rope stretched between two posts overhead, its length slightly uneven. Brenna passed beneath it. Edrin followed. Kayla's attention moved along the rope as it shifted slightly. No wind reached it. Thomas walked on. A figure crossed the road ahead, moving from one doorway to another. Their steps were measured, their movement unchanged as they passed through the lanternlight and into the dim space beyond. The door remained open. They continued. Another voice came from behind them. "You came along the road." The words did not carry far. Brenna did not turn. Edrin's gaze shifted slightly, then returned forward. Kayla's attention moved behind them briefly, then back again. Thomas continued. The road carried on ahead. The lanterns appeared at even intervals, though the spacing did not hold exactly. Their light settled across the ground in soft circles, leaving dim spaces between them. They walked through one, then into the next. A figure stood between two lanterns ahead, their form resting in the dim space between the light. As the group approached, the figure stepped slightly aside. Brenna inclined her head. The figure returned the gesture after a pause. Edrin's gaze met theirs briefly. Kayla moved past without turning. Thomas followed. The figure remained where they had stepped. The buildings continued. The spacing shifted. A window stood open along one wall. Inside, a lantern rested on a table, its light reaching only part way across the room. A figure stood beside it. "You came along the road," they said. The words remained within the room. Brenna inclined her head. Edrin's gaze rested there briefly. Kayla's attention lingered at the edge of the window. Thomas continued. They moved on. The lanterns continued in their spacing. The voices did not rise. The air remained still. Their steps settled into the same quiet rhythm as before. The words appeared without change. You came along the road. You came along the road. Each voice remained low. No one stepped forward. No one called them to stop. The figures remained where they stood. The doorways remained open. The lanterns held their light. They continued walking. The road carried on ahead between the buildings, its surface unchanged beneath their steps. Lanternlight rested in small circles along the ground, with dim spaces between. They moved through one, then into another. A doorway stood open to the left. Inside, a lantern hung from a beam, its light steady. A table rested beneath it, its surface bare. A figure stood beside the table. You came along the road, they said. Brenna inclined her head as she passed. Edrin's gaze moved toward the doorway. Kayla's attention rested briefly inside. Thomas followed. The words did not continue. They walked on. Another figure stood near the edge of the path ahead, their posture still, their hands resting loosely at their sides. As the group approached, the figure shifted slightly to the side. Brenna inclined her head. The figure returned the gesture after a pause. Edrin passed without slowing. Kayla moved past, her gaze already moving beyond. Thomas followed. The figure remained where they had stepped aside. The buildings continued in the same spacing. Windows stood open or closed without pattern. Some held light, others did not. The road moved between them. A lantern rested on the ground near one of the structures, its glow faint. The light reached only a short distance before giving way to shadow. They passed through it. No voices came from behind. A rope stretched between two posts ahead, its line uneven. Brenna stepped beneath it. Edrin followed. Kayla's gaze traced its length. Thomas continued. The road carried on. Another doorway stood open along the right side. No lantern lit its interior. The space beyond it held a dim outline of walls and floor. A figure stood just inside. You came along the road, they said. The words rested near the threshold. Brenna inclined her head. Edrin's gaze met theirs briefly. Kayla passed without turning. Thomas followed. The figure did not move. They continued forward. The lanterns appeared at intervals along the road, their light settling into the same quiet pattern. The spaces between them remained dim. A figure stood between two of them ahead, their form resting in the shadow. As the group approached, The figure remained where they were. Brenna inclined her head as she passed. The figure returned the gesture after a delay. Edrin followed. Kayla moved past. Thomas came last. The figure did not step aside this time. They remained where they stood. The road continued. The buildings extended further in, their spacing unchanged. The light lowered further, settling along the edges of the structures. No new voices came. No movement followed them. The path ahead held the same quiet surface. Brenna's steps slowed slightly. Edrin matched it. Kayla came level with them. Thomas followed. They moved forward a short distance more. Another lantern stood ahead, its light steady against the darkening ground. The space beyond it held no visible change. They entered the circle of light, then passed through. The road extended beyond. No doorway opened ahead. No figure stood waiting. The space held still. Brenna slowed again, her steps settling into a pause. Edrin stopped beside her. Kayla remained just behind. Thomas came level with them. They stood within the dim space between two lanterns. No voices reached them. No movement followed. The road ahead held the same quiet surface. Behind them, the lanterns marked the path they had walked, their light resting where it had been. Brenna turned. The motion was small. Edrin's gaze followed. Kayla shifted slightly. Thomas looked back. The road behind them held the same arrangement. Lanterns, doorways, figures set in place. A voice came again from somewhere along it. You came along the road. The words remained where they were spoken. Brenna faced forward once more. No one spoke. Then Brenna stepped back the way they had come. Edrin followed. Kayla turned with them. Thomas came last. The lanterns ahead became the lanterns behind. A figure stood between two lights as they approached. Brenna inclined her head. The figure returned the gesture. Edrin passed. Kayla followed. Thomas came after. The figure remained. They continued back along the path. The voices did not rise. The doorways remained open. The lanterns held their light. Their steps settled into the same quiet rhythm. They walked on. They moved back along the road. their steps settling into a steady rhythm. The lanterns that had stood ahead now rested behind them, then to their sides, then behind again. A figure stood between two lights as they approached, their posture still. Brenna inclined her head. The figure returned the gesture. Edrin passed beside her. Kayla followed. Thomas came after. The figure remained where they stood. A doorway stood open along the left. A lantern hung just inside, its glow resting across the threshold. A figure stood within. "You came along the road," they said. The words settled near the doorway. Brenna inclined her head as she passed. Edrin's gaze moved toward the figure. Kayla's attention rested briefly inside. Thomas continued. They walked on. The road lay ahead between the buildings, its surface even beneath their steps. The ground held the same worn smoothness. A rope stretched between two posts ahead. Brenna stepped beneath it. Edrin followed. Kayla's gaze moved along its length. Thomas passed under it last. The rope remained still. Another figure crossed the road farther ahead, moving from one doorway to another. Their steps were measured. They entered the doorway without turning. The door remained open. The group continued. A window stood open along one wall. Inside, a lantern rested on a table, its light contained within the room. A figure stood beside it. "You came along the road," they said. Brenna inclined her head. Edrin's gaze rested there briefly. Kayla's attention lingered at the edge of the window. Thomas followed. They moved on. The lanterns continued at their intervals, their light forming quiet circles along the ground. The spaces between them remained dim. They passed through one, then into another. A figure stood near the edge of the road ahead, facing the path. As the group approached, the figure stepped slightly aside. Brenna inclined her head. The figure returned the gesture. Edrin followed. Kayla moved past without turning. Thomas came last. The figure remained where they had stepped. The buildings continued in their spacing. Doors stood open or closed without pattern. "You came along the road." The voice remained low. They continued. A bench rested along the side of the road, its surface worn smooth. Brenna passed it without slowing. Edrin's gaze moved across it. Kayla traced its length with her eyes. Thomas followed. The road carried on between the buildings, the ground beneath their steps unchanged. A lantern rested near the ground ahead, its glow faint. They walked through it. Another doorway stood open along the right side. A figure stood just inside. "You came along the road," they said. The words settled near the threshold. Brenna inclined her head. Edrin passed. Kayla moved on. Thomas followed. The figure did not move. They continued. The lanterns appeared again at even distances, their light resting along the ground in soft circles. They passed through one, then another. A figure stood between two of them, their form resting in the dim space between the light. As the group approached, the figure remained where they were. Brenna inclined her head. The figure returned the gesture after a pause. Edrin followed. Kayla moved past. Thomas came after. The figure remained. The buildings began to open slightly, the spacing between them widening. The edges of the village drew nearer, though no clear boundary marked the change. The light beyond the buildings held a different quality, softer, less contained. They continued. A final doorway stood open along the side of the road. A lantern hung inside. A figure stood within. "You came along the road," they said. Brenna inclined her head. Edrin's gaze rested there. Kayla's attention passed briefly across the interior. Thomas followed. They moved on. The buildings thinned. The road extended outward. The lanterns appeared less frequently. The open land returned in long stretches. Grass lined the edges of the path. The air cooled. Behind them, the village remained. Ahead, the road continued. They walked on. The road carried them back toward the guild, the open land stretching alongside it in long, quiet intervals. The ground beneath their steps shifted between packed earth and stone, the surface worn smooth in places. The evening had settled fully. No lanterns marked the road here. The light came from above, faint and even. Brenna walked at the same steady pace. Edrin moved beside her. Kayla followed, her gaze moving outward and back again. Thomas walked with them, his attention resting where the road met the distance. No one spoke. Their steps settled into a quiet rhythm. The land remained open for a while, the fields extending without interruption. The line of trees ahead marked where the guild stood beyond them. They continued. The trees drew nearer, their trunks spaced without pattern. The branches overhead held the remaining light in still layers. They passed between them. The ground beneath their steps shifted slightly as the road met the outer edge of the guild grounds. The building came into view in the same gradual way as before. First the roofline, then the walls, then the lanterns set along the entrance. Their light rested steadily against the wood. Brenna approached without slowing. Edrin walked beside her. Kayla's gaze moved briefly across the structure, then settled forward again. Thomas followed. The door stood partially open. Warm light moved outward from within. They stepped inside. The guild hall held the same quiet presence as before. Lanterns hung from the beams, their amber light resting across the tables, the chairs, the maps that had not been moved. A pair of travelers stood near the far wall. The attendant worked near the hearth, aligning a small stack of papers. The fire gave a steady glow. Brenna walked further in. Edrin followed. Kayla moved slightly behind them. Thomas entered last. No one turned. The room held as it was. They crossed the hall at an even pace. The request board stood along the inner wall, set between two lanterns. Brenna came to stand before it. Edrin stepped beside her. Kayla remained a pace back. Thomas lingered just behind. The notices had been arranged across the board. Some sat higher, some lower. The parchment varied in tone and texture. Brenna's gaze moved across them. Edrin's attention followed. Kayla's gaze shifted between the board and the room. Thomas looked on. The lower portion of the board held fewer notices. Brenna's gaze rested there. Edrin looked as well. Kayla's attention moved to the same place. Thomas remained still. No one reached for the board. No one spoke. The lanternlight rested evenly across the parchment. The edges of the notices remained still. No mark showed where the lower notice had been. No pin remained. Brenna stepped back. Edrin followed. Kayla turned slightly. Thomas lingered a moment longer, his gaze resting on the board. Then he stepped away. The room continued. The travelers near the wall spoke in low voices. The attendant adjusted the same stack of papers. The fire shifted. then settled. Brenna moved toward the doorway. Edrin walked beside her. Kayla followed. Thomas came last. They stepped out into the evening air. The door remained partially open behind them. The lantern light from within rested along the threshold. Outside, the road lay quiet. No movement showed along it. No sound carried from the distance. Brenna stood for a moment, her gaze resting outward. Edrin remained beside her. Kayla's attention moved along the edges of the road. Thomas looked ahead. No one spoke. After a while, Brenna stepped forward. Edrin followed. Kayla moved with them. Thomas came after. They walked on. The road extended into the night.